I know I go on a great deal about why I don't like Suella Braverman and why I didn't like Priti Patel. And I think it's worth having a look at, well, I'd like to defend my dislike is not the particular people in question, though I do think their passion for an aggressive immigration policy, an inconsistent immigration policy, is disturbing, particularly Suella Braverman's dreaming of Rwanda. The relationship between the EU and the UK means that EU migration to the UK has genuinely fallen. But immediately before Brexit, there was a serious spike. And this is particularly obvious in places like Boston, which saw a massive influx of Romanians and Bulgarians with their families just before the borders closed. So instead of that slow trickle, which had been had certainly been taking place and had caused resentment, there was this massive influx, and now there's a wealth of people in Lincolnshire who simply haven't got to grips with English or with our customs, and that is a problem perhaps that the Brexiteers simply did not anticipate. It means that there's increasingly a division not only between sort of native Brits and immigrants who have settled in the area, but also between the immigrants who settled in the area before Brexit was declared and after. A stratification. And that stratification goes on in the immigration policies, which are simply incoherent. And that's one of the reasons that I find the Home Secretaries disturbing. I mean, they're simply carrying out the hostile environment that Mrs. May set up. And it's not, simply being nasty is not a policy. I think it's fundamentally wrong to start with, but I also think it's flawed in its conception, and therefore it's incoherent. It's chaotic. If you look, for example, at the Hong Kong BNO scheme, which accounts for 8% of, or which accounted in 2021 for 8% of arrivals here. That was a bespoke visa route, apparently, with very few restrictions on who could come here, very few restrictions on numbers or eligibility, or indeed how much people earned in order to merit the opportunity of coming here. And once they came here, there was a lot of support on offer. In contrast, the similar bespoke visa routes for Afghans and Ukrainians are filled with quotas and extraordinary bureaucracy, which means people simply have not settled at all. People are still caught out by the system. So what Priti Patel claimed on the 24th of March 2021 was fair and generous simply was not fair or generous. And to link the Hong Kong scheme with the Afghan scheme and the Ukrainian scheme is simply to live in cloud cuckoo land, because they're all so different, and each one is more increasingly inhospitable. The slow and bureaucratic process, for example, of settling Ukrainians is astonishing. Now, the new plan for immigration, which is the thing that Priti Patel put forward also in March 2021, still hasn't worked, still hasn't been implemented. It's still being considered. And yet it is so necessary to get it right. The limited routes that are on offer the limited legal routes, the limited accepted routes for migrants to use, even asylum seekers to use, are so limited and so useless that even Suella Braverman, on the 23rd of November, this is an important date, Suella Braverman on the 23rd of November, in response to a question by Tim Loughton, a fellow Conservative MP, in a committee hearing for the Home Office, Suella Braverman admitted that the only way a 16-year-old orphan from an unnamed African country could come to the UK and seek asylum would be if he made his way through an illegal channel crossing and then applied once he was on British territory this side of the channel. And yet, having made that admission very clearly, Suella Braverman is still trying to go ahead with the idea that anybody who comes to Britain by an illegal route will never be able to settle here, will never be able to claim asylum here. This contradicts the 1951 Refugee Convention that we helped to draft. So if we don't think that convention works, our job is to convene a global conference and get that convention redrafted or amended. To unilaterally simply say, well, we're signatories to this convention and we're not going to honour it, is to defy international law. And I don't think that's going to go down well. We've already had problems. Braverman had problems last year in October when she questioned the plans for Indian immigration, if you remember. The whole problem is this is piecemeal, this hasn't been thought out, and this is a knee-jerk response to the right-wing anti-immigration part of the Conservative Party, and indeed that sort of that trigger-happy part of the Brexit campaign, which I suspect was spearheaded mostly by the UKIP bureaucrats who, as we know, were drawn from some extremely dodgy organisations like the EDL and the British Nationalist Party. UKIP may not admit that, but I saw the evidence. So racism lies at the heart of the extraordinarily fragmented immigration policy that we have in practice, which probably explains why Suella Braverman feels so confident talking about invasions, and why Rhetoric, when presented with the appalling story of 222 children being trafficked from homes that they were allocated by the Home Office, simply dismisses the problem and says, well, most of them are Albanian and most of them are over 16. So if they're Albanian, it doesn't matter. And if they're over 16, they're no longer regarded as children. Well, that's not quite how the law sees it. So we can't simply redefine things because it's convenient. But that is exactly how British immigration policy has progressed since the days of Mrs. May. Convenience rather than need.